In the heart of Dubai, where the skyline gleams with the cold elegance of luxury skyscrapers and the streets hum with the roar of Ferraris and Lamborghinis, Amina felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage. She was beautiful, graceful, and flawlessly dressed in flowing ambience that concealed a deep, restless yearning she carried like a hidden burden. Behind her serene smile, behind the picture-perfect life, was a woman suffocating in a world of perfection, her heart craving something more, something real. Amina, in her late 20s, with fair skin and dark curls that framed her face like a halo, had eyes that seemed to hold a secret longing, a melancholy that whispered of unfulfilled dreams. Her life, though outwardly enviable, was far from the fairy tale it appeared to be. She was married to Called, a successful businessman in his mid-30s, whose sharp jawline and neatly trimmed beard conveyed authority. He was a man who managed a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, a man whose life was defined by status and wealth. At first, these qualities had drawn Amina in, his devotion to his family, his relentless drive. But as the years passed, his devotion seemed increasingly reserved for his work, not for her. Called was a good man. He was loyal, hardworking, and generous. But he was also distant, emotionally absent, preoccupied with the ever-growing demands of his business and social commitments. Amina's presence in his life had become a mere accessory. They rarely spoke of their feelings anymore, and their marriage was reduced to occasional dinners and weekend outings. Their sprawling villa, nestled in one of Dubai's wealthiest neighborhoods, stood as a monument to their status, but it felt like a prison to Amina. Inside its ornate walls, decorated with Persian rugs, antique furniture, and artwork exuding cultural pride, Amina felt increasingly isolated, like a beautiful ornament in a house that didn't truly belong to her. She spent her days lost in a haze of domestic duties, managing staff, attending charity events, and hosting dinners for Khaled's business associates, while her true desires lay dormant, suffocated by the expectations of her role. Every now and then, she'd slip away, searching for a moment of freedom, an escape from the rigid life she had been confined to. It was during one of these aimless walks that she stumbled upon something that would change her life forever. A local horse stable, hidden deep in the desert, far from the glittering facade of Dubai's skyline. The moment Amina saw the horses, something inside her stirred. These magnificent creatures, muscular, with flowing manes, held a power that immediately drew her in. They weren't just animals, they were beings that seemed to understand her, that seemed to speak to her in a language only she could comprehend. At the stable, she met Abdul, an elderly Bedouin man with weathered skin and wise, kind eyes. His voice, soft and melodic, had a calming effect on her as he spoke about the horses, where they came from, how they were trained, and the bond between horse and rider. For the first time in months, Amina felt a spark of genuine interest, a connection to something real, something outside the shallow expectations of her life. She began visiting the stable regularly, under the pretext of errands or meetings with friends. With each visit, she spent hours brushing the horses, talking to them, and watching them gallop gracefully in the paddocks. There was something almost magical about their presence, something that made her feel seen, understood. The gentle nudge of a horse's nose, the soft nicker of a greeting, the nuzzle that felt like a warm embrace, all dissipated the loneliness that had weighed so heavily on her. In the quiet of the desert, away from her demanding life, Amina found solace. She could lose herself in the rhythm of grooming, in the therapeutic peace of being around these majestic creatures. Of all the horses, Zishan stood out. He was the largest, the most powerful, with a regal air that made him seem almost otherworldly. He seemed to recognize Amina's need for something more, something that had been missing from her life for so long. She didn't know it yet, but the bond she was forming with Zishan, would lead her to discover a side of herself that had been buried under years of duty, expectation, and conformity. The desert, the horses, and Abdul were awakening something inside her, something that could no longer be ignored. In this unlikely place, amidst the endless dunes of the desert, Amina found not just an escape from her marriage and the suffocating world of wealth and status, but a glimpse of freedom, a taste of the life she had longed for. The horses became her sanctuary, the one place where she could be herself, and in their presence, she began to uncover a power within her that would ultimately change the course of her life forever. A pure bred Arabian stallion with a coat as black as the night and eyes that shone like amber in the sunlight. There was an undeniable chemistry between Amina and Zishan from the moment they met. Whenever she approached him, the horse seemed to look at her with an intensity that went beyond mere animal instinct. It was as if he recognized something in her that even she couldn't fully understand. Amina found herself drawn to him, and in those early days, the bond they formed was more than just about writing or training. Zishan was a confidant, a silent partner in Amina's quest for something more. She would talk to him as though he could understand every word, her dreams, her fears, her frustrations. And Zishan would listen, nodding his head gently in what seemed like approval or empathy. As Amina's affection for Zishan deepened, she began to feel a stirring inside her, a mix of exhilaration, anticipation, and fear. The relationship with Zishan was not just an affair with an animal. It was a symbolic rebellion against the life she had been coerced into living. There were stolen moments of intimacy. A quick kiss on Zishan's nose, a gentle caress of his mane, a shared silence as they rode together into the sunset. These moments brought a sense of freedom that Amina had craved for years, a temporary reprieve from the constraints of her role as a wife. It was an illicit romance, hidden away from the watchful eyes of Dubai's elite, where any deviation from tradition could be met with scandal and shame. But these moments of bliss were fleeting. As the days went by, Amina's guilt began to mix with her desire. She knew that if Khalid found out, the consequences would be severe. The thought of the scandal, the judgment, and the potential for lost respect in her community plagued her. Yet there was an undeniable pull, a magnetic force that kept her returning to the stable, to Zishan, to a place where she could be herself, even if just for a few hours. The affair, while intensely personal, was also incredibly risky. Amina found herself balancing the thrill of secrecy with the terror of discovery. She was playing with fire, and she knew it. But the allure of Zishan was too strong to resist. It was as though the horse understood her need for escape, and in him, Amina found a kindred spirit. One who could provide the comfort and connection she so desperately desired. Collard's absence only heightened Amina's feelings of isolation. His work took him away frequently, leaving Amina alone with her thoughts and her growing obsession with Zishan. She had started making excuses to avoid social events and family gatherings, claiming fatigue or headaches. The truth was, she simply didn't want to be around people. The contrast between Collard's attention to detail in his business dealings and his neglect of Amina at home was becoming more apparent. He would spend hours poring over architectural plans, negotiating deals, and attending high-profile events, all while Amina's world shrank to the confines of their villa and the stable. This increasing distance only fueled Amina's growing resentment and dissatisfaction with her marriage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the desert, Collard returned from one of his trips. Amina had hoped for a moment alone with him to discuss the growing strain in their relationship. But Collard was preoccupied, absorbed in his phone, scrolling through emails and messages, even as they sat across the dinner table. Amina tried to engage him in conversation, to share her day and her thoughts. But Collard's responses were curt, his mind clearly elsewhere. The realization that her husband was more connected to his work than to her only deepened Amini's sense of emotional abandonment. That night, as Amina lay in bed, she could hear Khaled's occasional mutterings from the study as he continued working late into the night. The intimacy that had once defined their relationship, shared laughter, whispered secrets, even playful teasing, had become a distant memory. Amina's heart ached with the knowledge that she was more alone in her marriage than if she were actually alone. The stable with Zishan became her refuge, a place where she could feel alive, away from the emotional void at home. There was no need for pretenses with the horse, no expectations to meet, no roles to play. It was just Amina and Zishan sharing a connection that was free of judgment and expectation. As the days turned into weeks, Amina found herself more and more consumed by her secret life. She would like to call it about her whereabouts, telling him she was visiting friends or shopping, when in reality, she was at the stable with Zishan. The lies became a necessary part of her existence, a means of maintaining the delicate balance between her public facade and her private yearnings. Amina began to question whether she was being fair to Khaled, whether it was right to keep something as significant as an affair a secret from him. But the consequences of truth were too daunting. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her social standing, the respect of her family, or the life she had known. One evening, as Amina rode Zishan through the desert, she felt a sense of exhilaration that she hadn't felt in years. The wind whipped through her hair, the sun bathed the landscape in a warm amber hue, and for a few precious moments, everything seemed perfect. It was during this ride that Amina realized she was falling deeper into the affair, that Zishan was becoming more than just a temporary escape. She was in love with the horse, or at least with the freedom and connection he represented. This realization was bittersweet. Amina knew that if she continued down this path, it could only end in tragedy. But the fear of losing Zishan, of giving up the only source of real joy she had found in years, was too great. As Amina's feelings for Zishan grew, so did her guilt. She was torn between the passion of her affair and the duty she felt towards Khaled. The internal conflict was a constant source of torment. She loved Khaled, but the love was different, more of a companionable affection than a passionate, all-consuming connection. The affair with Zishan represented a rebellion against the constraints of her life, a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of self that had been lost over the years. But with every stolen moment with Zishan, a sense of guilt deepened. She was deceiving not just Khaled, but herself as well. The line between right and wrong had become blurry, and Amina wasn't sure where she stood anymore. As Amina continued to delve deeper into her secret relationship with Zishan, the lines between reality and fantasy blurred. The intensity of her affair had reached a fever pitch, and the thrill of the illicit relationship was beginning to consume her. The connection she felt with Zishan went beyond mere physical attraction. It was an emotional refuge, a sanctuary where she could be free from the demands and expectations of her life as college wife. But this freedom came at a price, one that Amina was about to pay dearly. One hot afternoon, Amina rode Zishan through the vast desert, the sun casting long, unbroken shadows on the sand dunes. The landscape seemed endless, a metaphor for the isolation Amina felt in her marriage and her affair. As she guided the horse through the dunes, a sense of impending doom hung in the air. Khaled had become suspicious. The detective he had hired to follow Amina had reported back with alarming findings. The stability that Amina had sought in Zishan was now teetering on the brink of destruction. Khaled's jealousy and rage had been simmering for weeks. Ever since he received the first reports of Amina's secret meetings, he had confronted her before, But each time, she managed to evade his questions or deflect his suspicions. But this time, the detective's evidence was too damning to ignore. It wasn't just circumstantial, it was incontrovertible proof of an affair. Amina's secret life was on the verge of being exposed, and the consequences were going to be catastrophic. As Amina and Zishan approached a secluded spot in the desert, Collard's car appeared on the horizon. He had followed her again, suspecting she was meeting someone who was not just a friend or a business contact. The sight of Collard's car sent a chill down Amina's spine. She had hoped to keep her affair hidden forever, but the walls were closing in. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Zishan sensed the tension and slowed his pace. But Amina urged him on, desperate to escape from the confrontation that was coming. Collard stepped out of the car, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Amina felt a surge of fear mixed with a sense of inevitability. The truth was out now. The detective's report had left little room for denial. "I came to see Zishan," she replied, her voice quavering. "I've been spending time at the stable." Collard's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to her. "Why didn't you tell me, Amina?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you keep this from me?" Amina couldn't meet his gaze. She felt a mix of guilt and shame. Guilt for betraying Khalid and shame for letting her emotions get the better of her. "I didn't want to lose you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was afraid." College anger seemed to reach a boiling point. He took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. "Afraid," he repeated, his voice rising. "Afraid of what, Amina? Losing your reputation? Our family's name?" His words cut through Amina like a knife. She had never seen Khalid this upset, this hurt. It was as though the man she had married was a stranger, one who had been replaced by a figure consumed by jealousy and pain. As the confrontation escalated, Zishan grew restless. The tension in the air was palpable, and the horse's ears flicked back and forth as though trying to comprehend the situation. Amina reached out to calm him, but Collard's voice interrupted her. "You brought this animal between us," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "This isn't just about a horse, Amina. It's about you and me." Amina took a step back, her heart racing. She could see the detective lurking nearby, hidden in the shadows, watching the scene unfold. Collard's fury reached its peak, and he lunged at Amina in a fit of rage. Amina tried to defend herself, but in the struggle she lost her footing and fell to the ground. Zishan reared up in alarm, his powerful hooves kicking out as though to protect his rider. Called in his anger, stumbled backward, losing his balance. Amina's fall seemed to trigger a chain reaction. Zishan bolted, galloping away into the desert, leaving Amina and Khalid alone. In that moment of chaos, something snapped in Khalid. The years of neglect, the sense of betrayal, and the discovery of Amina's affair all coalesced into a single explosive emotion. He was consumed by rage, by the thought of losing not just Amina, but his social standing and control over his life. Driven by an irrational fury, Khalid reached out to grab a nearby rock, a moment of blind, desperate action. He brought it down hard, striking Amina's head. The force was brutal, final. Amina's body lay motionless on the sand, a pool of crimson spreading around her. The detective, witnessing the entire scene, was paralyzed with shock. He had expected to gather evidence, to confirm suspicions, but not this, not murder. Collard stood over Amina's lifeless body, his breath ragged, eyes wide with terror. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The realization of his actions hit him like a sledgehammer. Collard's facade of control was gone. He was no longer the successful businessman or the respected husband. He was a murderer, and the weight of his crime crashed down on him in an instant. The detective wasted no time in calling the authorities. The police arrived within minutes, securing the crime scene and arresting Khalid. As they led him away, his eyes darted from Amina's body to the detective, to the approaching sirens. He was a broken man, a man who had once stood tall, but was now reduced to a shell of his former self. College's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The news spread quickly, and soon, the whispers of scandal and tragedy were all anyone could talk about. Amina's death was ruled a murder, and Khalid became the prime suspect. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The detective's report, eyewitness accounts, and physical evidence all pointed to him as the killer. As Collard was led away in handcuffs, the community was left grappling with the shock of the murder. Amina's death was mourned, but the questions about her affair and the circumstances surrounding her murder were difficult to ignore. The societal judgment was swift and unforgiving. Amina, who had once been seen as the picture of grace and dignity, was now a tragic figure. A woman caught between duty and desire, caught in a web of secrets that ultimately led to her death. The investigation was swift. The detective, now a key witness, provided a detailed account of the events leading up to Amina's death. The court proceedings were a spectacle, a mix of tragedy and spectacle, as Khalid's motives were scrutinized under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights. His defense attorney tried to paint Amina's affair as the catalyst for his actions, but the evidence was damning. The murder weapon, the rock, was found nearby, and witnesses confirmed Khalid's presence at the scene. There was no escaping the truth. Khalid's expression was that of a man who had lost everything: his family, his reputation, his freedom. He seemed almost indifferent to the proceedings, as though he had already resigned himself to his fate. In the courtroom, the air was thick with tension and emotion. Amina's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with sorrow and anger. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and now they were losing any chance of justice. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically, painting a picture of a jealous husband who, in a fit of rage, had taken Amina's life. The defense argued that Khalid was driven to madness by the betrayal of his wife and the shock of discovery. But the jury was not swayed. The evidence was too overwhelming, too clear. Amina's affair with Zishan was not just a betrayal to call it, but a violation of societal norms, one that could not be easily forgiven or forgotten. Khalid's expression remained stoic throughout the trial. He did not look at Amina's family, did not respond to their cries of anguish or their demands for justice. It was as though he was lost in his own world, disconnected from the reality of his situation. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a guilty verdict. Khalid was sentenced to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and he would spend the rest of his life paying for the crime he committed in a moment of passion and rage. The courtroom emptied slowly. Amina's family and friends left with a sense of closure, even though it came at the cost of a broken family and a lost life. The story of Amina's affair and its tragic end spread like wildfire through Dubai. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of secrecy and the devastating consequences of living a lie. Amina, who had once been seen as a symbol of grace and elegance, was now remembered for a darker, more tragic aspect of her life. The scandal was covered extensively by the media, each report delving deeper into the complexities of her affair, her murder, and the fallout that followed. As the story of Amina's life and death unfolded, Zishan disappeared from public view. The horse, once a symbol of Amina's longing for freedom and connection, was now just another part of the tragic narrative. Zishan was sold off, the memories of their secret rendezvous fading into the sands of time. The authorities could find no trace of the animal, and it became a symbol of lost innocence, a victim of Amina's and Khalid's tragic choices. Years passed, but the impact of Amina's death lingered. The community continued to wrestle with the aftermath. The questions of duty, desire, and the price of living a lie. Amina's story became a tale of forbidden love and forbidden choices, a reminder of the fragility of life and the destructive power of jealousy and betrayal. It was a stark, heartbreaking lesson about the consequences of living a life hidden from the truth, a life that ultimately ended in murder.